Please, sir, stay with me. Clear!
Where's your mom or dad?
I don't know.
I can't leave you here. I'll walk you to the L.
I think this thing is really happening. You can see it out there.
Can I have your attention, please? We have shelter. We have food. This is the best thing that could have possibly happened.
We're the traveling symphony. We travel for a reason. Just tried to make the world make sense for a minute.
No one finds people from before.
Sometimes I think we should be out there looking for them.
I come to you with an invitation to the Museum of Civilization.
Beware the prophet. Beware the children who follow him.
What happened to you in the first 100?
I was lucky. It had grown up and cared about me.
Welcome to the Museum of Civilization.
The before. It's coming back. I won't let it.
We have to abandon the future. All that matters is the now and what got us to this point. And we're in this together. And we're a family now.
So, how many people have we seen now? Plow guy, the two bandana meth guys.
The lady with no eyes.
The lady with no eyes.
Hello. We are thrilled to be back and kicking off the new year by welcoming y'all to this conversation with an amazing creative team and cast behind HBO Max's limited series Station 11.
I'm Jen, and this is Caitlin. And if this is your first time coming across ATX TV, you've picked an excellent entry point. This group of panelists and this series form a perfect circle on the Venn diagram of our interests.
I'm trying to quickly make a joke about the traveling symphony circle that they do each season, but I'm just not fast enough. So I'm going to say it's very true. This show does all the things for us, from being devoted Halt and Catch Fire fans
to The Leftovers. Obviously, Shakespeare's pretty great.
And now Station 11.
You and I were extremely hyped for this show because we follow a lot of very smart TV people, including today's moderator, who are also very hyped for this show. And in a way that seems sort of impossible given the current state of our world, I think it somehow exceeded our very high expectations.
I could agree with that. And I'd like to lobby for its inclusion in our own Museum of Civilization.
Duly noted and approved.
I do want to say before we go any further that this conversation is happening after the finale has aired. It will have spoilers as we talk about the series as a whole, including the finale, probably the book. So you've been warned. And if you haven't finished or started, pause, come back. It'll be here waiting for you as an extension of your time with these brilliant people. Official spoiler warning has been given. Everything is on the table.
Yep. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today to talk about this very special project, and to our partners at HBO Max for continuing to put gems like this out into the world. All 10 episodes of Station 11 are available for you right now on HBO Max, so please seek it out and enjoy.
With that, I'd like to bring out our moderator, Chris Ryan, editor of The Ringer, co-host of one of our favorite podcasts, The Watch, to introduce our panelists. Chris, hi.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to introduce the panelists that we're going to be bringing up from Station 11. This is my favorite show of 2021, and I'm so excited to be talking with members of the cast and the creative team behind it. First off, I'll bring up Danielle Deadwyler, who plays Miranda, then Daniel Zovatto, who plays Tyler / the Prophet, Mackenzie Davis, who plays Kirsten, Himesh Patel, who plays Jeevan, Patrick Somerville, the creator and showrunner and executive producer, Jessica Rhoades, the executive producer, Hiro Murai, the director and the executive producer, and Jeremy Podeswa, the director and executive producer. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris.
So Patrick, I'll start with you. Just bringing up my questions here. So I wanted to ask, obviously, this is a beloved book, and adaptation is a very delicate process. And this is a pretty unique one where I know that you had a relationship with Emily going into this process. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to the novel and the author and the process of moving on from the book as a text that you obviously connected with to something that you needed to sort of make your own.
Yeah, I barely knew Emily, I should say at that point. We had spent one very interesting day together, reading together in the suburbs outside of Chicago, but had connected and definitely had some conversations that were memorable. And that was I think 10 years ago that we had that interaction. The book came out a couple of years after we had that conversation and immediately skyrocketed and sold 1 million copies around the world. And I was like, oh, Emily nailed it. That's amazing. And then I love the book too. And I think I was surprised that it was initially being someone was trying to make it into a film, because there's so much. I didn't understand how you could do all the things that we hopefully successfully ended up doing in our show, but just do all the things in the novel that needed to be done in a feature. So I was glad years later to also hear that had failed the script process along the way. And it coincided with me getting a chance to go have a meeting with one of our producers, Scott Steindorf. And in there is where I said, this can't be a movie. It has to be a limited series. And here's what I think you should change too. There's some kind of big ideas that, and Hiro can attest to this too. In the first conversation he and I had, I think most of the big changes were already kind of figured out. And one being the idea of Jeevan and Kirsten spending those 80 days together, rather than just being kind of like ships in the night and losing each other. Right after they have one moment in the book that we do in the show too, when Jeevan helps her get to Tanya the Wrangler, and that's it in the book. But it felt like a great opportunity for episode 1 to have these two strangers kind of making their way somewhere but getting to know each other. That's a good episode. We needed something because in the book too, Jeevan is alone and with his thoughts, and Emily's voice as a narrator is incredibly powerful, and I think it does so much work. I think most of the adaptation ideas in general, we're trying to get back what Emily's voice as a novelist gives that story. So this was one. And then I think there was always a sense that we wish there was more Jeevan. That obviously happens because of their connection, but now it happens even more. We know more about his story when he's alone. And I think Miranda is another big character we wanted to know more about and do a little bit differently, not just for doing it differently, but I think as visual storytellers, we had the challenge of also making the graphic novel visually and knowing the graphic novel. And once we knew that, Hiro and I slowly, I think, we're approaching the conclusion that like the book's got to be good for this to work right. But if the book's good, that means that's deeply intertwined with Miranda's character. Who Miranda is has to be very, very known, I think, early in the story, i.e. episode 3. So all of, and then in the writer's room, there was always this deep desire to have Miranda's character causally matter somehow to the stakes of what's going on in the airport at the end, more than just the story, the more powerful story, I think, which is how art can hold and help people when the author of the art isn't there, when the maker of the thing isn't there. That's the kind of A story. But the B story we wanted really badly was, how can we get an interaction? How can we have Miranda come back and matter to this year 20 story in a way that is hopefully a fun surprise, for people who just watched episode 10. But I want to hear Hiro's response too about that. Those are the big. We talked about it when we met. But there's a reason for them.
I when we first sat down and talked about it, I always tell people that his first pitch was that it was a post-apocalyptic story about a Shakespeare troupe, and my initial reaction is like,
Cool.
That's cool.
I should read the email. You're like, I don't like either of those things, but okay, let's have coffee.
but then he went on. We had a 3.5 hour coffee where he just kind of went through the whole thing, and it's a sprawling story, and following like 6 different characters and different timelines, and I feel like I didn't do much talking at all. I was just kind of like listening.
Oh, yes, you did.
In my memory of it, which was 15 years ago and a pandemic ago, I just remember just getting slowly kind of just like enraptured in this sprawling thing. And it was so fascinating because, none of this was on paper yet. I could see like Pat's sort of beautiful mind abstractions kind of floating in the air. And he basically took me until the very, very last minute of what was, at the time, the last 3 minutes of the whole series. And I was just like, I got chills down my spine, and I was just so wrapped up in it. I didn't even quite know what the show was as a whole. I just knew that journey that I felt, in that 3.5 hour coffee, where I had like 4 coffees, was like, it was just so unique. And I just haven't felt that before. And so whatever the journey that gets us there felt like it was worth it, And so that was the biggest selling point for me. And big part of that was the whole Jeev and Kirsten story, and I hadn't read the book at that point. So the post-apocalypse and the Shakespeare troupe, what felt like it just came at a crazy left field. But I after the meeting, I read the book, and I just kind of saw all the points that sort of Patrick took different turns on, and it just made I don't know, at least for the TV adaptation, it just felt like such a smart move to make the whole thing feel more whole, at least as a TV watching experience.
One of the things that I love so much about the show, and I think people are responding to, and Himesh, I can throw this to you actually, is the amount of different kinds of tones that get brought into it. It's funny, it's scary, it's got an adventure to it, it's got romance to it in a lot of ways. But I was curious, when you're going through what the characters are going through, how do you kind of calibrate in your head, like, wait, would they be making jokes? Like, would they be rapping Tribe Called Quest? Like, how did you sort of find the life and the joy in these moments that were so dire?
I think it's interesting that notion of would they do that, because I think, and that's what I love about the show, is that it's so truthful. I think in truth you would, in a situation like that, if the opportunity arose where you could sample some guy's speech and turn it into the sort of bed of excursions, then why not? Because it brings joy. People have been responding to that episode and been saying like the euphoria of that moment is so wonderful when you juxtapose it with the situation they're in. And I think that's what part of survival is. I'm sure we've all been doing it to some degree over the last 2 years now, 2 years of living through this thing. We have to find the joy in ways, in inventive ways. And so that moment specifically felt really truthful to me, and it felt like the moment that they became a family. And there are various moments that are far more sort of what we're used to seeing when it comes to post-apocalyptic sort of stories, where you have to dig into the reality of how grim things can get. But then there's also the moments that are just as true that we don't see as often, which is one of the things I love about the show as well, is the joy that people find and the humor that people find in these moments. And I loved getting to do all that. I love that I didn't just spend what wound up being nearly 18 months of my life kind of digging through something that was just really, leaning into the sort of grim reality of what people are living through. that I got to do a lot of really great, fun, enjoyable stuff as well.
And Danielle, you get to play off one of my favorite comic actors in Tim Simons, who I actually have been lucky enough to play golf with once. And I can assure you that he would definitely play golf on the last day of the world. But there is this kind of sort of constellation of very funny people throughout this show. Tim, David Cross. Did that make really difficult material a little bit lighter or a little bit more lived in, because you had like these moments of levity?
Oh, sure. I mean, he's ridiculous. He's hilarious. But I mean, Miranda is deep in the game and the seriousness of the situation. But, he allows for a little bit of buoyancy to take place in the body when he takes it there, right? So it feels good to let the heat off a little bit, especially him.
So my next question is for Hiro and Jeremy. Obviously these kind of dystopian stories have been told on screen for decades, and there's lots of different ways to do it. There's lots that I love. And I was curious what kind of conversations the two of you and the directors had about maybe tropes you wanted to avoid about telling a story about a pandemic and telling a story about, like a post-apocalyptic landscape. And I'm also very curious to know about the sort of transition from the early days with Jeevan and Kirsten to the sort of more, pastoral moments of the show where it's the traveling symphony going around the wheel.
Jeremy, you want to kick this one off?
Sure. Well, Hiro and I spoke a lot at the beginning about just what the difference between year 0 and year 20 was going to be. But there was also that time period in between year 0 and year 20 that had to be worked out as well. But Hiro had done such an amazing job on year 0 when beginning of the pandemic in episodes 1 and 3. And, there were certain things, obviously stylistic things that we wanted to continue through the entire show. So it still felt like the same show, but it also had to feel different post-pandemic. And I think, I thought maybe first more about year 20 than I did about year 1, which was the cabin in the winter. But year 20, I think, really wanted to be something in opposition to, but kind of in harmony with what Hiro had already done. And, for me, the opposition was about being slightly in opposition to what post-apocalyptic things generally are, which is, dour and dark and menacing and troubling and Walking Dead or The Road. And this very much didn't want to be that kind of thing. And there was this idea and this notion that Patrick and all of us had spoken about, which was really that, many good things happen in the future when there's the end of civilization as we know it, when technology ends, really, other things emerge, and there's a kind of return to nature, and there's a kind of, and for me, like I described it to myself as a kind of Arcadia thing, where there's this kind of pastoralism, and there's a kind of beauty in the kind of overgrowth and the return of things that have been kind of subdued by the contemporary world that we live in. And when all those things are let free and they can grow again and they can take over, there's something kind of beautiful that happens in that. And in the way that there's beauty among the wreckage, of everything, kind of thematically through this entire show, I think we really wanted to see that visually. So it was, kind of an opposition to the kind of urban contemporary year 0 world that Hiro had established and transforming it into this other thing. But also there were like stylistic things that Hiro had established that we wanted to, employ. And there was ideas of like, big and small, this idea that the show is an intimate epic in a way. There's this great intimacy between characters, but it also has this epic quality. And that existed in year 0, and we wanted that to exist in year 20 as well. So those kind of tropes, which were like established but reconfigured, could play through.
When Pat and I first talked about it, I mean, I think, part of the reason I said, like, I don't really like both of those things, it came from a place of like, this is before the pandemic happened, but I think there was already a kind of a nihilism fatigue, for us. Like, we're kind of tired of seeing people desperately doing desperate things to survive, and just aesthetically, it's just, it's a very gray monotone genre, and so we were trying to figure out how to make that feel new, and like, how do you take a new angle on post-apocalypse? Like, can it be mundane? Can people be petty in the pandemic or in the apocalypse? Can things be serene, ethereal, like all those things? So we kind of built backwards from that. And for me, the episode 1 and 3 was, we always kind of thought of it as, okay, if the year 20 is going to feel sort of open and ethereal and kind of in a way beautiful, then 1 and 3 should feel the opposite. It should feel kind of steely, and the urban landscape should feel a little bit monolithic, and it's just kind of overbearing in a weird way. And so we kind of built it outward from that. At least that's how I remember it anyway.
I should say too, Helen Shaver, one of our other directors, was sort of, because of the timeline of how we were shooting, was the first director to shoot outside really in the summer.
Wow.
So she did 4 and 6, and we actually shot 2 last, which, I mean, Jeremy and I have talked about how like that was a gift, because you guys in the cast, Mackenzie and Danny in particular, you guys were so on fire with your characters already. You knew exactly who you were. It seems, it felt like a lot, to play those very critical scenes that are right at the top of the show, which was unusual. And then that was a gift. But Helen really like did a thing with outside. We were all kind of agoraphobic as a show. We had to be, because of the winter, and everything inside got stacked to the front of the shoot schedule. And then suddenly we were outside, and it was like a different thing happening. And I mean, Mackenzie and Danny, I think it probably felt different while shooting too. It certainly looks different, but it's kind of interesting that all 4 of our directors had different challenges that they were responsible for as facets of our show. But I don't know, Danny and Mackenzie, did it feel different in the show once we were doing outside stuff instead of inside stuff?
Definitely. I mean, the only tough thing about this line is that we started doing outside stuff before it was warm. So it wasn't like ecstasy, like we can breathe, we're free. It was like -6 Celsius in a shorts and a t-shirt doing night shoots outside, being like, I'll kill you.
Playing summer is not summer.
But and then we shot the rest of the show outside and shooting all the golf course stuff and the traveling symphony in the wood. Like, I mean, the end of the show that we shot with Jeremy and Himesh, and then these like huge vistas watching the traveling symphony make their way to the golf course and across these like beautiful green, like verdant leaves in Ontario. It was so nice. It really did feel like the end of quarantine after that sort of interim stage of punishment.
Turns out there's a bit more in ours.
Yeah.
In our world. Danny.
Mackenzie, Danny, did you want to talk about
I just
going
wanted to
outside?
hear if Danny had a similar experience.
Canada's beautiful. We had I mean, I just remember poor Mackenzie. She was trembling with her knife, holding it as still as she could. But it was just some nights were pretty cold. But I loved working, out in nature. We were around so many beautiful places, so it was fun. Yeah.
Himesh just had to drag himself through a 15-inch blizzard.
Yeah,
that was his outside.
The Revenant.
Just hearing Mackenzie talking about how cold it was, and I have no sympathy.
Just in shorts and a t-shirt. Okay, fine, you win.
Jessica, obviously a lot has been discussed about how the show, unfortunately mirrors some circumstances that we find ourselves in now. But I wondered if you could talk to me a little bit about the stop down in production and then the return to production, and what, if anything, changed about the series because you had this break, right? So like, was there anything that maybe you started down the road with something and then we're like, you know what, maybe we should do this differently, or the tonally should shift, or just out of like necessity, this is going to have to change?
The interesting thing is the show on paper, if you will, would have been the same. Right. Patrick was writing through the pandemic, and so some things probably incepted, into the process. But I really do think on paper it would have been the same show. What I think really just changed was the sense memory of every single person making the show. So everyone on this,
screen, but also everyone behind the scenes, every actor, every crew member, every single person brought this experience to the table. So everything just became, kind of incepted on a cellular level with this truth. So whether it was, I remember we prepped episode 7, which obviously Mackenzie, everyone in the apartment, we prepped that from quarantine. Literally, we were all in our apartments or houses or whatever state we were for 2 weeks straight when we entered Canada. So, you couldn't leave your house. It wasn't just the normal, what everyone else had horrible thing the world experienced about like being small. It was literally, you were trapped inside for 2 weeks. So I think that you understood that feeling, but also, gosh, when we started shooting again after what was, 6 months or whatever it had been for every single cast and crew member, you had that moment of like, okay, deep breath, mask, shield, whatever it is, we're going back to work. But the moment you got there, you remembered your work was getting to create and be in community and have this collaborative thing. We saw it, you saw it in every single department, people just getting to be artists together. And that is what the show is about. That was the thing that was different. So, but those really strange things, just like Himesh was just saying about how comedy still exists, or, Hiro saying pettiness, like, I love Mackenzie being, she's like, who the fuck's Karen? Like that is like one of my favorite lines, but it's true. In the middle of a goddamn pandemic, we still are like, oh, that person texted me and I'm so annoyed. But you can understand how these things exist together, I think, on a real cellular level. And I think that's what changed and made the show maybe a little more special than it might have been before.
Mackenzie, I wanted to ask you about the role that like these other texts kind of play throughout the show. So obviously there's the graphic novel, there's also a lot of Shakespeare throughout the series. And then when we get to the end, I was really struck by that moment when you were like, I'm the director, and your character says that she's going to be taking over the direction. And I was curious whether or not that was for you, like this, maybe not final step, but a step in a transformation for Kirsten, where she goes from maybe not being the protagonist, or this Hamlet figure, but somebody who maybe has figured some stuff out for herself and is now ready to help others do the same, specifically, obviously, Daniel's character.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to frame becoming a director from an actor as like the graduation from childhood to adulthood. Sure. However, I was thinking about that moment as like, I had a friend, a woman who's a director, and she was an actor first. And I remember she talked to me about her transition into directing being one that was always there, but because she was a little girl who liked to like perform and create, she was always funneled into this actress position. And that's not the automatic thing that you tell a little girl, like, you're going to be a director, at least whenever we were growing up. And I kind of thought something similar with Kirsten, that she's like, she's a born actress. It's what she does. She's like a storyteller. So that's what she is. And so everybody tells her she's an actress, and that's where she thinks her talent lies. But naturally, when she's freed from the parameters of like the hierarchy of adult child and like trying to make it in the theater world in Chicago, she naturally becomes a writer and a director in this apartment with Jeevan and Frank. And so there is this like sort of seedling of what she really wants to do. And then she kind of has to like complete the cycle of going back to her childhood, sort of resolving this trauma, and then being able to embody this role that I think is the natural sort of storyteller fit for her. Yeah.
I think every this wasn't intentional, but in casting, I think it happens energetically, and it was sort of like a delightful surprise. But every major actor on the show is an artist in some other form, I think. And we didn't, Hiro and I and Jeremy, we didn't ask that question. I guess once we got to the music stuff, Jeremy, we were specifically asking that question. But it just so happens that everyone on this panel I know does other things too. And like and that, I think there's something very important about that baked into the show's investigation of what it means to be an artist. Like we get funneled into one way, or perhaps we're really, really, really good at one way, whether or not we like that, whether that's the path we go down. But I'll speak for myself. Like there's always been other things percolating, but it's hard to find room for them once you become super committed down one lane too. But everyone's sort of always becoming in the show something else. And I think Danielle is a visual artist, a performance artist, many kinds of artists. But I think Miranda's character in the show, it's really interesting. She does not self-identify as an artist. She's in logistics. Meanwhile, over the 30 years in her life, you know, she's making this profoundly perfect thing. And she has to, so she is an artist, she just doesn't say. But I don't know, Danielle is probably, I heard you speak about it on the podcast, but that idea that like the other parts of you that were in you were helping you play Miranda, the arts, not just I'm an actor, but I don't know, something deeper was you were doing, definitely, that was very mysterious. We were watching it, and I think that this is true for everyone, but I would love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's hard to navigate multiple paths, but those things are always super interwoven in who you are. And I think that's what I experience as Danielle, that's what Miranda experiences as herself. You're trying to, those things are always with you. And so every move you make is informed by the other thing that you do. So I'm constantly informed by what does it mean to think multimedia in as an actor, right? So you're trying to synthesize what it means to conduct, right? Like Kirsten is like, I'm going to be a director now. You are always that thing. It's just when do you handle the reins differently? And yeah, it's they're always there. That's what I think about.
Scary though.
It
scary
is
though
horrifying.
to put the reins in the hands of the less developed side of you, but you got to do it sometimes.
Yeah,
I feel like I should
balance
note,
is always being sought.
I feel like I should note that Pat plays banjo in the score of Station 11. If you listen carefully.
Yeah, at the end of episode 7. That's
what?
Yeah.
Wow.
You know what? That actually is a great segue to a question I was going to ask later. But one of the things that me and my friends have really reacted very, very passionately to is the music in this show. And as performers, you get to go to Video Village or whatever and check it out and see, oh, this is.
There is no Video Village anymore after the pandemic.
Oh, well, then you have no idea what it's going to look like, and you have no idea what it's going to sound like. Watching this series, how about the music in this show? It's like it's a character itself.
Yeah.
Well, props to Dan Romer, our composer, first and foremost, because he delivered a gigantic, just like a masterpiece of music. And this is after we wrapped. This is what a lot of the fall has been. He also lives at 0.2 miles away from us, and I was over at Dan's place this whole fall as he was going through episode to episode. He has a unique ability, I think, to emotionally be present in the scene as a storyteller himself. That's the thing again. He's a storyteller who happens to be an amazing musician. So when he's carving out the moments, amplifying them, letting them be silent, whatever, he's so there for what the actors were doing months or years ago, what the directors were intending. Like Dan's doing the same thing everyone's doing, and I think that's actually really rare to have someone who is feeling their way through it. Dan is he cries a lot, and he would say the same too. He unafraid to cry mid-conversation. He just keeps going. I love this about him. But I was sitting watching him do, like, when Himesh is, when the shot to the snow after we find out what happened with the wolf attack and the crazy like a Bach, gigantic organs come in, like that kind of death sound. I was sitting behind Dan as he was doing that. And he was just crying also. And then the screen is there with Himesh. But there was like a vulnerability happening in the creation of the music that you can feel now, I think, when you watch the show. That's not normal at all.
I feel
There's
like
also,
oh,
sorry,
go ahead. Matt, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just gonna say, I feel like the show knows what music means to humans. Like everything Dan did, amazing. Everything Liza did with all of our needle drops. I think on the productions that we were the beneficiaries of the first live music so many of us had since the pandemic started. And I don't think we realized it until we were in it. And it happened again and again. So Mackenzie and Himesh and Naban and Matilda, when Matilda sings, and it chilled the entire small set.
Everyone started crying. Everyone on set started crying.
And it was just an emotional moment, but I don't think we knew at that moment it was because it was also a live music. It was such a beautiful, peaceful moment. And then when Naban performed Excursion, like the entire crew was just like, holy, like this is such
Everyone
a
started dancing.
And
That's
then
what,
it
like
happened again.
getting a Canadian crew dancing. That's impressive stuff.
That was also when we were small. So then we were at the airport, and that was when we had really opened up, and it was with Jeremy's episode, and it was the first time we had extras, and we had the whole traveling symphony, and we had the airport. And again, we were all just doing our jobs again, and Deborah Cox starts, singing, and the entire, I think, thank God some people kept doing their jobs. Jeremy was probably one of them. I was like down for the count. Live
I was
music.
crying.
It just
crying at the monitor. I remember
so
that.
I think you see it in the Hoot Nannies, and you see it in the, I don't know, Mackenzie, does that feel real?
That's exactly what I was going to say, just that there's like strata of music in the show, from like the really intimate private performance, like obviously the score, and then moving inwards to the smallest being Matilda's Noel, and then like, Deborah singing Train to Georgia. Like that night was unbelievable, and she's such a generous performer. Like I love people who are talented and don't sort of hold it away from you. I go up to Deborah all the time and I'm like, sing a song. She's like, what do you want to hear? And she'll just sing for you, and it's such a beautiful thing to do for people. And then when we were shooting episode 2 outside at that, like we were doing Hamlet, and everybody was just around a campfire in a circle, and there was just like there's just many strata of like sort of intense, lovely musical moments in this show. And it's really, it's so true to how we survived and are surviving our pandemic as well, as you just sort of like have to burst out with noise or song or dance sometimes to keep going.
And can I just say Philippine singing the dirge as well?
Oh, gorgeous.
Which was just so incredible. And we were just also transfixed by that. I mean, it was so haunting and beautiful, and hearing that in the middle of the night, and I don't know, it was just, there were magical moments on the show related to music, and that was really,
it was healing. I wasn't there for that night, but I found Midnight Train to Georgia at 4 a.m. of an incredibly difficult, like 2-week stretch of shooting. Everyone's exhausted. It's healing to hear someone do that.
About how long a turnaround is when Deborah's like, what do you want me, what should I sing?
What next?
What's your, for the performers, I'm curious what the experience has been watching it. I don't know if you've watched it before it aired, or if you've been watching it all like over the course of its season, but are there moments that surprised you, or because this is obviously a pretty it's a fragmented casting. You're doing stuff, Danielle, you're doing stuff in this hotel room and on the Malaysia set, and then Daniel, I know like you get to work with Mackenzie, and Himesh, you're largely working with Matilda, but what's it been like kind of taking in the totality of the show, and what surprised you? What were some of your favorite moments that maybe you weren't in?
I'll start. I'll start. It's super emotional. I mean, the show does what the show does. It takes you on this incredible ride. I came back after a year because I did 1 and 3, and then in 2021 we came back to Toronto. So I'm adrift, right? Literally. And I don't watch, whilst filming. I didn't watch everything beforehand, but it's deeply compelling. It's tenderhearted, right? Like I'm just as fucked up as everybody else. And of course, I'm like gagging at excursions, right? Because I didn't see that episode. So everything that is like doing, it's doing all that. The dynamism is it's a relief to be a part of, you know?
Yeah.
It's actually kind of a trip to see all of you guys on the same screen. Like when we first hopped on the Zoom, it was kind of like, oh, hey,
yeah,
everybody's here. You know?
Yeah.
At the same time.
Yeah, at the same time.
Now.
Yeah,
it was quite
yeah.
Oh no, go on, go for that.
No, Himesh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, for me, like, you know, the way it worked out for me was that I hadn't met anyone apart from Matilda, Mackenzie, Naban, and then obviously everyone behind the camera. And the way it timed out was about this time last year. We flew to Toronto. We shot episode 7, and then we shot episode 9. And so the bulk of my work was I'd done it, and I just knew that I was going to then move on to what you then see in episode 10. So it was kind of quite moving for me when I got to actually meet everyone, because I hadn't met anyone. These characters were in my head, but I didn't know exactly who everyone was. So then when I got to join up with everyone, it really felt to me like I was really part of this huge tapestry, and I was finally getting to see the whole thing. And it was really, and actually that, Deborah performing that night was a real sort of, it felt like the closing of the circle in a way. Because I felt quite separate from it, which speaks to the experience that we had shooting it in Toronto. It wasn't easy in a lot of ways. We couldn't hang out outside of work the way that you usually would, because we had strict protocols and everything. But it just meant that I hadn't felt that connection yet until I then joined up with everyone, and it was nice to have finally gotten to do that.
I'm thinking of you standing next to the wagon, Himesh, and doing that little scene with Dylan, our Dan, but like you and the Traveling Symphony together. That was like a very suddenly new thing after literally a year and a half, 2 years of not being together. What was that? Was that a good day? I remember you. I'm sorry if the drone shot getting the wagons. I was looking at the monitor and I was like, somebody's dancing. Who was dancing between shots as we're setting up the drone? And it was you dressed as old Jeevan dancing.
Yeah, who's that old guy? Who's that happy old guy? What's his deal? Yeah, it was fun. And also for me, the relief of just being outside and not being freezing was nice. But no, it was nice like hanging out with everyone,
Yeah.
Did everyone have, Danny and like Mac, did you guys have that when your characters finally got to the airport too? Like in terms of seeing David and Caitlin, and did you have a similar experience?
Yeah, I think it feels kind of how it feels in the show, where you're like, I know I'm going somewhere. I know we're all gonna meet up one day, and when's it gonna happen? And yeah, we had these like quite isolated, like I wasn't even, episode 5 was shot completely without my involvement. Like I didn't know what was going on. I saw it the other night. I mean, I'd seen it on my computer, but it's not really the same thing, but I watched it the other night and was like blown away by it. It feels like everyone had their own little camp. There was like the Chicago camp, and there was the airport camp, and then there was the Traveling Symphony camp, and I got to like see a bunch of them, but not all of them, and it was so ecstatic when we all got to kind of like join forces.
I should say just Danny and Mackenzie probably most had to play their parts in almost memento levels of reverse. Unlike Himesh, Himesh, I don't know if I've said this to you, you're the only actor who played in a straight line all your scenes. Like you experienced a linear version of your character, and I can't tell when I watch the show, which is a testament to the actors' abilities to kind of map, I think, backwards or whatever. I can't tell when I watch the show that you went in a straight line, and Danny showed up and like suddenly was in an important episode 8 scene. Like that was his arrival to our group. And I think then we were going backwards to episode 6 and largely 4 and then 2 for these guys. But that's not easy, I have to say. I think I could see that it was not easy, but you guys, you knew somehow what to do. It's sort of like Jessica's question for the two of you also, but like, I don't know, what did you know about your dynamic with each other that made it stable? It always seemed like the two of you knew what you were playing with each other in your dynamic back and forth, emotionally or energetically or something. I don't know. I think that's really interesting, but it's a testament to your abilities as actors that you did so successfully do that. No one can tell.
I think we really liked each other.
You
know, like that counts a lot.
That's not always true, right?
Yeah, I found the crossboarding taxing.
It's
I
hard.
didn't always know how to fit this into the narrative that we knew exactly what was going on. But I found it. I wasn't always 100% sure. But I do feel, I mean, I was struck, Hiro, hearing you talk about how you had this 3-hour coffee with Patrick where he laid out the entire show to you, but you still didn't really know what was going on, but you were deeply moved and were like, okay, which was my experience of talking to you guys when you told me like every single beat. And I left it being like, well, I have witnessed a beautiful journey, but I couldn't tell you what was going to happen. And at no point in making the show did I know what was happening. But I was like deeply moved by faith and some sort of alchemy to like go forward and backwards. And like, it's like the great glass elevator. Like it was just a different direction every day. But there was a lot of like, there's something inside this thing that isn't losing its magic. I don't understand it logically, but I'm like compelled by it, and that's extremely meaningful and for me really, really, really rare.
Well, I unfortunately have to wrap up this talk. I wish I could speak to you all for another hour or two about the show. It's meant so much to me. I know it's meant so much to the people watching. So thank you so much to the cast and filmmakers behind Station 11, and we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you guys.